A single mom sleeps on the street in winter with her son, but a stranger offers her shelter, and the next day she discovers a truth that shocks everyone. Leave a rating from 0 to 10 for my story in the comments. Your opinion is very important. And subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The biting wind of the great industrial metropolis of Chicago cut through the 30-year-old single mother's bones like shards of ice. Her arms trembled as she carried her 4-year-old son, who shivered under the tattered blanket that barely protected him from the harshest cold in recent years. For 3 days, they had eaten nothing but scraps found in the trash, and hunger had become a constant ache that pierced her stomach like needles. Each step on the snow-covered streets was a fight against despair. Her shoes, riddled with holes, let in the icy water, and she felt her feet losing sensation. The boy mumbled incomprehensible words, his weak breath forming small clouds of vapor that quickly disappeared into the frigid air. She needed to find shelter before the predicted blizzard arrived in full force. The doors of establishments closed one after another as she approached. Looks of pity and revulsion mingled in the faces of the people who hurried past, wrapped in expensive coats, carrying shopping bags that she could only dream of having. Without identification and without money, she was as if invisible to the world, except when she bothered someone. Her son began to cry softly, a weak sound that broke her heart. She squeezed him tighter to her chest, whispering words of comfort that she could barely believe herself. How had she come to this point? How had a woman who once had a normal life become a beggar in the streets, fighting to keep her only treasure alive? It was then that the shadows of a dark alley stirred, and a man of 30 emerged with elegant strides. His expensive overcoat contrasted brutally with the misery around him, and his face had the perfection of someone who had never known suffering. His eyes studied her for a moment that seemed eternal, analyzing every detail of her desperate condition. "You need shelter," he said in a soft, almost hypnotic voice. It was not a question, but a statement that made her recoil instinctively. Men like that didn't appear out of nowhere to help women like her without wanting something in return. Experience had taught her that kindness always came at a price, but her son's body was getting dangerously cold. She could feel how he struggled to keep his eyes open, how his breathing was slowing down. The storm was fast approaching, and the first gusts of snow began to lash their faces with increasing violence. "I have a property on the outskirts of town," the man continued, taking off his leather gloves to reveal his impeccable hands. "You can stay until you get better." There was something in his eyes that she couldn't decipher, a mixture of determination and secrecy that made her uneasy. Instinct screamed at her to refuse, to run, to disappear into the streets, even if it meant certain death. But her son murmured her name in an almost inaudible voice, and she felt as if she were losing him right there, in her arms. The choice was made by desperation, not reason. "Why would you do this for strangers?" she asked, her voice hoarse from thirst and cold. The words came out with difficulty, laden with distrust and fear. No one helped without a reason, especially not rich men who appeared at just the right time to be a coincidence. He smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he replied, but there was something rehearsed in those words, as if he had repeated them many times before. "My car is right there. I can take you now." The snow began to fall more intensely, turning the world into a white and cold blur. Her son had stopped crying, which scared her more than any sound of pain. Silence meant that he was giving up, and that she could not allow. "All right," she whispered, the words torn from her throat by despair. "But if you try anything—" The threat died on her lips, because they both knew that she had neither the strength to defend herself nor to protect her son. The car was luxurious and heated, an absurd contrast to the icy hell of the streets. She settled into the back seat, wrapping her son in her arms as she watched the city disappear out the window. The man drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road, but she could feel him watching her in the rearview mirror. The mansion emerged like a castle in the darkness, all lit up and imposing against the stormy sky. It was bigger than any place she had ever lived, with vast gardens that disappeared into the night. It seemed impossible that someone could live in a place like that, alone, ready to receive strangers. Inside the house, the warmth hit her like a wave, making her realize how cold she was. A woman of 60 appeared in the hall, her worried eyes studying the newcomers with an indecipherable expression. There was something maternal in her face, but also a tension that suggested secrets kept for a long time. "Take them to the blue suite," the man said to the woman, his voice echoing through the immense hall. "And prepare something hot for them to eat." He turned to the single mother, and for a moment he seemed to want to say something more, but he only nodded and disappeared down a dark hallway. The suite was more luxurious than any hotel she could imagine. The bed was huge and soft, covered with sheets that seemed to be made of silk. There was a fireplace crackling gently, filling the room with a golden and cozy light. The bathroom had a tub large enough for 2 people, with fluffy towels stacked next to it. After a hot bath and a meal that brought tears to her eyes, she laid her son on the giant bed, watching as he finally relaxed and fell into a deep sleep. For the first time in weeks, he seemed at peace, his breathing calm and regular. But she couldn't sleep. Something was wrong. No one did this for strangers. No one offered luxury without expecting anything in return. And there was something in that woman's eyes, something that seemed like a silent warning. She got out of bed, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark gardens, where shadows seemed to move among the trees. Morning arrived, with a disturbing silence. The single mother woke up startled, realizing immediately that something had changed. The side of the bed where she expected to find signs of the presence of the man who had saved them was untouched, as if he had never been there. An icy anguish took over her chest as she ran to her son's room, who was still sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the tension that grew in the air. On the bedside table, an elegant letter awaited with her name, written in impeccable handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened the expensive envelope, revealing words that left her more confused than calm. "I had to travel for urgent reasons that I cannot explain now. Stay as long as you need. The house is yours while you are here. Don't worry about anything." There was no signature, just a strange symbol at the end that she did not recognize. The man's sudden absence should have been a relief, but instead it aroused a growing paranoia. Why would someone leave strangers completely alone in such a valuable property? And why was there this mysterious urgency that made him disappear without proper explanations? Each question generated 2 new ones, creating a labyrinth of distrust in her already fragile mind. The woman of 60 appeared at the door with a breakfast tray, her movements careful but tense. "He always does this," she said in a low voice, almost whispering. "Appears and disappears without warning. But this time, it was different." There was something in her eyes that suggested knowledge of secrets that she was not willing to share completely. "Different how?" asked the single mother, trying to control the anxiety that grew in her veins. The answer came accompanied by a warning look that made her recoil instinctively. "He's never brought anyone home before. Never." The pause that followed was loaded with unspoken meanings, as if each word had been carefully weighed before being spoken. The days began to turn into a strange and surreal routine. The single mother gradually took on the tasks of housekeeper, a function that no one had requested, but that arose naturally from her need to feel useful. Cleaning that immense house became a desperate meditation, a way to keep her mind occupied while trying to understand her precarious situation. Her son flourished in the vast gardens, running among the flowers and laughing in a way that she hadn't heard in months. Seeing his joy was simultaneously the greatest gift and the most cruel torture, because she knew that all of this was temporary, a bubble of happiness that could burst at any moment, throwing them back into the misery of the frozen streets. It was during the second week that the coincidences began to bother her seriously. Cleaning the library, she found a book marked on a specific page where someone had underlined a sentence about second chances for the lost. In the kitchen, she discovered a handwritten recipe for her son's favorite dish, a dish that she had never mentioned to anyone in that house. The older housekeeper began to whisper increasingly specific warnings. "There are drawers that should not be opened," she said, as she swept the main hall, her nervous eyes constantly checking her surroundings, "and basements that should not be explored. This house holds secrets that can hurt those who are not prepared to know them." The nights became the worst time. Alone in the luxurious room, she heard strange sounds echoing through the corridors, footsteps that didn't belong to anyone known, doors that closed on their own, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She began to question whether her mind, weakened by hunger and recent suffering, was not playing cruel tricks on her perception of reality. During a particularly quiet afternoon, while her son napped in the garden under the shade of an old tree, she decided to investigate the main office. The drawers were locked, but one of them had been left ajar, as if someone wanted her to find it. Inside, old photographs were scattered in a seemingly casual way, but with an organization that suggested deliberate intention. Her heart almost stopped when she recognized one of the faces in the photographs. It was herself, but years younger, smiling next to people that she couldn't completely remember. How had this photo ended up there? And why were there so many other images of places that aroused a disturbing familiarity, as if they were fragments of forgotten dreams? The housekeeper appeared silently behind her, making her jump violently. "You shouldn't be messing with this," the woman said, but her voice carried more sadness than reprimand. "Some truths are too dangerous to be discovered quickly. He knows what he's doing, even when it doesn't seem like it." "Who is he, really?" The question came out with despair, laden with weeks of accumulated tension. "And why do I have the feeling that all of this was planned?" The answer came through a prolonged silence, followed by a deep sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades of secrets kept. "There are things about your life that you don't know," the housekeeper said finally, her wrinkled hands trembling slightly. "Things that were hidden for your own protection, but that maybe it's time to discover. However, each revelation has a price, and we are not always prepared to pay." The storm that was brewing outside seemed to echo the inner turmoil that grew in the single mother's chest. She looked out the window, watching the dark clouds gather on the horizon, and she was absolutely certain that her life was about to change again in an irreversible way. But this time, she didn't know if it would be for better or for worse. Her son woke up from his nap screaming, a nightmare that left him in tears. As she consoled him, she noticed that he was babbling words about the grandma who is always sad, referring to the housekeeper. How could a 4-year-old perceive emotional nuances that adults tried to hide? And why was he calling her grandma when he had never used that term before? That night, while walking through the corridors trying to calm her restless mind, she heard voices coming from downstairs. The housekeeper was talking on the phone, her voice laden with an urgency that she had never shown before. "She's finding out too fast," the trembling voice said. "I don't know if we'll be able to keep the secret much longer." The telephone conversation she had overheard the night before echoed in the single mother's mind like an alarm siren that wouldn't stop ringing. She had spent the rest of the night awake, analyzing each word, each intonation, trying to decipher the meaning behind that mysterious dialogue. Who was on the other end of the line? And what secret was so important that it needed to be kept at any cost? Morning brought a torrential rain that turned the gardens into a somber and melancholy scene. The housekeeper avoided her gaze, moving through the house with a palpable tension that made the air feel heavier. Each movement seemed calculated, each word carefully chosen, as if she were walking on a minefield of dangerous truths. "I need to show you something," the housekeeper said finally, her voice so low that it was almost lost in the sound of the rain beating against the windows. "But first promise that you won't ask questions until I finish explaining everything." The request came with a pleading look that revealed decades of suffering kept in silence. They went down together to the basement, a place that the single mother had instinctively avoided since she arrived at the mansion. The environment was damp and cold, lit only by old lamps that created dancing shadows on the stone walls. The smell of mold, mixed with something older, deeper, invaded her nostrils, causing a sensation of growing claustrophobia. In a corner, hidden behind dusty shelves, the housekeeper revealed a secret compartment that had remained closed for years. Inside, boxes of documents awaited as silent guardians of secrets buried by time. The housekeeper's trembling hands pulled out stacks of yellowed papers, each one telling a part of a story that seemed too impossible to be real. "This house belonged to your family," the housekeeper said, her voice breaking slightly. "Your grandmother, your mother, they all lived here before everything went wrong." The documents showed property deeds, birth certificates, and family photographs that revealed familiar faces in contexts completely unknown to her. The revelation struck her like lightning. How could she have lived an entire life without knowing her true origins? The photographs showed a prosperous family, owners of a magnificent estate, smiling people who seemed to have everything in life. But where were all these people now? And how had she ended up on the streets, with nothing and no one? "There was a fire," the housekeeper continued, each word coming out with increasing difficulty. "Your mother managed to save you, but she couldn't go back for the others. The house was sold to pay for medical debts, treatments, funeral costs. You were left with neighbors who promised to take good care of you, but they moved away without a trace." The pieces of her life's puzzle began to fit together in a painful way. The fragmented memories of childhood, the recurring nightmares about smoke and screams, the constant feeling that something important was missing, it all made sense now. She had been a lost child, raised by people who never told her the truth about her origins. "But how do you know all this?" The question was choked with emotion, mixing anger with a deep sadness that seemed to come from far away. "And why are you telling me now?" The answer came with tears that the housekeeper had held back for too long. "Because I am your grandmother," she said, the words echoing through the basement like confessions freed after decades of imprisonment. "I survived the fire, but I was disfigured, burned. By the time I finally recovered enough to look for you, it was too late. You had completely disappeared." The world seemed to stop for an eternal moment. The single mother looked at the housekeeper's wrinkled face with entirely new eyes, searching for resemblances that now jumped out as obvious evidence she had ignored. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile, even some gestures were genetic echoes she recognized in herself. "For years I looked for you," the grandmother continued in a choked voice. "I hired investigators, followed false leads. I never gave up. When I finally found out where you were, your situation was so desperate that I had to act quickly. The man who brought you here has been working for me for years, searching for you." The revelation about the private investigator brought a new dimension of shock. Nothing had been a coincidence. The encounter on the frozen streets, the offer of shelter, even the way he had disappeared, everything had been carefully orchestrated by a desperate grandmother to find her lost granddaughter again. "Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning?" The question was laden with a pain she didn't know how to express properly. Decades of suffering could have been avoided if the truth had been revealed sooner. "Why all this charade, all this mystery?" "Because I had to be sure," the grandmother replied, her hands gently touching her granddaughter's face. "I needed to watch you, to know who you had become, to see if you could accept such a difficult truth. And because I was afraid you would reject me when you found out I had failed to protect you, when you needed it most. The 4-year-old boy came running down the basement stairs at that moment, as if he had instinctively sensed that something important was happening. He ran directly into the arms of the grandmother he had just discovered, affectionately calling her Sad Grandma, the nickname he had created in recent days. The child had perceived what the adults were trying to hide. "He always knew," the grandmother said, hugging her great-grandson with tears in her eyes. "Children feel these things in a way we adults have lost. He recognized me as family from the first day, even when I tried to keep my distance." The rain outside intensified, creating an aquatic symphony that accompanied the moment of family reconnection. 3 generations were finally reunited in the basement that held the secrets of the past, surrounded by the documents that proved not only an emotional, but also a considerable financial inheritance. "There's one more thing," the grandmother said, hesitating before continuing. "The property was never really sold. I bought it back piece by piece, under a different name, waiting for the day you would come home. Legally, this house has always been yours by right of inheritance. I just kept it safe until you were ready to claim it." The final revelation about the property brought a relief mixed with an overwhelming responsibility. She was not just a beggar who had found temporary shelter. She was the rightful owner of a fortune that included not only the mansion, but also financial investments that had grown over the years through careful management. But as she processed all this transformative information, a strange sound echoed from the floor above. Heavy footsteps walked through the main hall, and a familiar male voice called their names. The investigator had returned, and from the urgency in his voice, he brought news that could change everything once again. The grandmother and granddaughter looked at each other with a mixture of hope and apprehension. After so many revelations, what other surprises still awaited them? And could they finally live in peace? Or were there still more obstacles to face on this journey of painful discoveries and emotional reunions? The heavy footsteps upstairs echoed with an urgency that made the single mother's heart race violently. She held her newfound grandmother's hand as they ascended from the basement, her son running ahead with the innocence of someone who didn't yet fully understand the magnitude of the revelations that had transformed their lives forever. Each step on the stairs felt like an eternity, laden with expectations and fears about what awaited them. The private investigator was in the main hall, his clothes soaked from the torrential rain and his expression tense, suggesting important news. His eyes moved quickly between the 3 generations gathered, and a smile of relief replaced the initial concern when he realized the truth had finally been revealed. There was something different about his posture, a lightness that wasn't there before. "The last of the documents have arrived," he said, pulling a waterproof folder from his briefcase. "And there's news that will change everything for good." His voice carried a contained emotion that made everyone draw closer with growing curiosity. The 4-year-old hid behind his mother's legs, instinctively sensing the tension in the air. The grandmother led them all to the main living room, where the fireplace crackled softly, creating a cozy atmosphere that contrasted with the emotional storm that had dominated their lives in recent weeks. The investigator arranged the documents on the coffee table, each paper representing a piece of the puzzle that was finally being completed. "The bank has finally located all the accounts that belong to your family," he explained, addressing the single mother with a respect she was still learning to accept. "In addition to the property and the investments your grandmother maintained, there was a special savings account your father opened for you before the fire. The money has been growing with compound interest all these years." The numbers on the documents were hard to process. It wasn't just about financial stability, but a considerable fortune that would ensure security for several future generations. The woman who had begged on the frozen streets now discovered she was the owner of an estate that included stocks, treasury bonds, and fixed-income investments that had appreciated substantially over the decades. "There's more," the investigator continued, his smile growing. Your grandmother wasn't the only survivor of the fire who looked for you all these years. There's a network of distant relatives and family friends who never gave up on finding you. They've heard about the reunion and are coming to town to meet you. The revelation about other living relatives brought an avalanche of conflicting emotions. Decades of absolute loneliness were being replaced by the prospect of an extended family she never knew she had. The idea of belonging to something bigger than her small family unit of two was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. The grandmother began to tell stories about each person who would be visiting, revealing a network of relationships that had been kept alive through hope and determination. Distant uncles who had moved to other cities, cousins who had grown up hearing stories about the lost granddaughter, family friends who never forgot the tragedy that tore everyone apart. "For 6 months," the grandmother said with tears in her eyes, "I planned every detail of this reunion. From the moment the investigator found you on the streets to this final revelation, I wanted you to have time to recover, to get to know the house, to feel safe before you found out everything." The investigator then revealed the last secret he had kept. His motivation for taking the case had not been purely professional. He was the son of one of the family's best friends, someone who had grown up hearing about the tragedy and had always felt compelled to help. His commitment to the search was personal, driven by the need to right a wrong that had marked his own childhood. "My father always said that a family shouldn't be separated by circumstances," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "When I finally had the resources and knowledge to search for you professionally, it became the most important mission of my life. Seeing you all reunited now is the fulfillment of a dream I've carried for decades." The 4-year-old, who had remained silent during the revelations, approached his grandmother and whispered something in her ear that made her smile through her tears. The child had asked if they could stay forever now, if they wouldn't have to sleep in the cold on the streets anymore, if they finally had a real family. The storm outside began to subside, as if nature itself were celebrating the resolution of the conflicts that had dominated their lives. The late afternoon light filtered through the windows, illuminating the hall where 4 people, 3 generations and a loyal friend, shared a moment of peace that seemed surreal after so much suffering. "There's one condition for all of this," the grandmother said softly, looking directly into her granddaughter's eyes. "You have to promise that you will never feel alone again, that you will never again believe you have no value, that you will never again let the world convince you that you don't deserve love and care." The promise was made through tears that washed away decades of pain and self-loathing. The single mother finally understood that her resilient and determined personality had not been a curse that kept her alone, but rather the quality that allowed her to survive long enough to find her family again. In the following months, the mansion was transformed into a true home. Her son grew up surrounded by the love of a dedicated great-grandmother, running through the gardens he now knew as his rightful territory. The mother discovered a talent for managing the wealth she had inherited, using part of the resources to help other families in situations similar to the one she had faced. The investigator became more than a hired professional. He became an honorary member of the family, someone whose sense of justice had made the impossible possible. His agency began to specialize in family reunification cases, using the experience he had gained to help other lost people find their way back home. The grandmother could finally rest, knowing she had fulfilled the promise made decades ago to protect her descendants. Her final years were filled with the joy of seeing her granddaughter flourish in her true identity, and her great-grandson grow up in an environment of love and security that she had always dreamed of providing. During the following winter, when the snow once again covered the estate's gardens, the reunited family watched from the living room window a landscape completely different from the one that had witnessed their initial despair. What was once a scene of death and hopelessness had transformed into a symbol of renewal and hope. The story ended as all true love stories should end, not with grand promises of eternal perfection, but with the quiet certainty that, regardless of future challenges, no one would face life's storms alone again. The family had been restored not only on legal papers, but in the hearts of each person who had learned that love can survive the worst tragedies and bloom again when we least expect it. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story with a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.